My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I'm 26 years old. Standing outside my childhood mansion with nothing but a suitcase and $200, I watched my parents slam the door in my face on what was supposed to be my birthday celebration. They'd just given me an ultimatum: marry their business partner's son or never come home again. I chose freedom over their golden cage, but what they didn't realize was that throwing me out would be the biggest mistake of their lives. Little did they know, this was the moment that would cost them everything. Before we dive into this incredible journey of betrayal, survival, and ultimate triumph, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will absolutely blow your mind. Make sure to subscribe because this tale of family betrayal and billion-dollar revenge is just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Just 6 hours earlier, I had walked into our family's sprawling estate expecting birthday cake and celebration. Instead, I found my parents, Richard and Catherine Martinez, sitting in the formal living room with documents spread across the mahogany table and expressions that could freeze hell itself. My father, a man who built his empire on oil refineries and commercial real estate, looked at me with the same cold calculation he reserved for hostile business takeovers. My mother, always perfectly coiffed and socially pristine, wouldn't even meet my eyes as she twisted her pearl necklace between manicured fingers. "Rebecca, darling, we need to discuss your future," my father announced, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that had intimidated boardrooms for 30 years. The endearment felt hollow, mechanical, like everything else in our relationship had become since I'd graduated from Stanford with my MBA 2 years prior. I noticed Trevor Blackstone sitting in the corner armchair, his presence immediately setting off alarm bells in my head. Trevor was the entitled heir to the Blackstone shipping fortune, a man whose idea of conversation revolved around yacht specifications and trust fund distributions. His cold blue eyes watched me with the same predatory interest a snake might show a cornered mouse. The documents on the table weren't birthday gifts or family business proposals as I'd initially hoped. They were marriage contracts, financial agreements, and what essentially amounted to a merger proposal between our family's business empires. My Stanford education, my dreams of building my own consulting firm, my autonomy as an adult woman, none of it mattered to them. I was simply another asset to be leveraged for maximum return on investment. The irony wasn't lost on me that they'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars educating me at one of the world's premier business schools only to treat me like chattel in an arranged marriage. "This is insane," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper as the magnitude of their betrayal sank in. "You can't seriously expect me to marry someone I barely know just to expand your business portfolio." My mother finally looked up from her pearls, and the disappointment in her eyes cut deeper than any physical blow could have. "Rebecca, dear, this is how successful families maintain their position. Love is a luxury we can't afford when billions of dollars are at stake. Trevor is a suitable match from an excellent family, and this union will secure both family legacies for generations." The conversation that followed revealed layers of control and manipulation I'd never fully understood. My trust fund, which I'd always believed would be accessible when I turned 30, was apparently tied to conditions I'd never agreed to. My parents had been monitoring my bank accounts, my friendships, even my dating relationships throughout college and graduate school. They'd systematically isolated me from anyone they deemed unsuitable while orchestrating social situations to throw me together with their preferred candidates for my eventual husband. Every family gathering, every charity gala, every seemingly casual introduction had been calculated moves in their long-term strategy to control my life. When I stood up and declared that I would never marry Trevor or anyone else they chose for me, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tense negotiation to all-out warfare. My father's face turned the particular shade of red that preceded his most explosive business confrontations, and my mother's composure cracked to reveal a viciousness I'd only glimpsed in her dealings with social rivals. They called me ungrateful, selfish, and naive about the realities of maintaining wealth and status. They accused me of being brainwashed by liberal professors and threatened to cut off all financial support if I didn't comply with their demands. The argument escalated beyond anything I could have imagined when my father stood up and declared that if I couldn't appreciate the opportunities they were providing, perhaps I needed to experience life without their support to gain perspective. Before I could process what was happening, my mother was instructing household staff to pack my belongings while my father called his attorney to discuss immediately freezing all accounts connected to my name. Trevor watched the entire spectacle with smug satisfaction, occasionally interjecting suggestions about how they might bring me to my senses through strategic pressure. Within 3 hours, everything I owned was packed into suitcases and boxes that were unceremoniously deposited on the front steps of our mansion. Neighbors from our exclusive gated community gathered to witness the spectacle, their whispered conversations and cell phone cameras capturing my humiliation for posterity. The woman who had been groomed from birth to take her place among America's financial elite was being cast out like a common criminal, and everyone in our social circle would know about it before sunset. My parents' final words to me were delivered through our head of security. I had until midnight to remove myself from the property, and any attempt to return would result in a call to the police for trespassing. Standing outside the ornate iron gates with my Honda Civic packed to the roof and exactly $237 in my checking account, I realized that my life of privilege and preparation had ended in the span of a single afternoon. The 26 years I'd spent as Rebecca Martinez, daughter of billionaire entrepreneurs, were over. Now I had to figure out who I could become as Rebecca Martinez, woman without a family, fortune, or future plan. The only thing I knew for certain was that I would never give my parents the satisfaction of crawling back to accept their terms, no matter what the cost. The Sunset Motel on the outskirts of downtown wasn't exactly the Ritz-Carlton, but it was what my rapidly dwindling funds could afford. The neon sign flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows across the cracked parking lot as I hauled my designer luggage up the exterior stairs to room 207. The contrast between my Louis Vuitton suitcases and the worn carpet with suspicious stains was almost comical, if my situation hadn't been so desperately serious. The room smelled of industrial disinfectant and cigarettes, despite the prominent no smoking sign, and the air conditioning unit rattled like it might explode at any moment. Jake Sullivan appeared at my door the following morning, carrying a toolbox and wearing a maintenance uniform that had seen better days. He was the motel owner's son, probably around my age, with calloused hands that spoke of actual work and eyes that held genuine concern rather than calculation. When he noticed my expensive belongings scattered around the shabby room, he didn't ask invasive questions or make assumptions about my circumstances. Instead, he simply fixed the broken air conditioning unit and mentioned that the diner across the street served decent coffee if I needed somewhere to think. It was the first act of uncomplicated kindness I'd experienced since my world imploded. My attempts to find employment suitable for someone with an MBA from Stanford proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. The business community in our city operated like an intricate spider web, and my parents' influence reached into every corner where I might potentially land a position. Phone calls that initially showed promise would end abruptly after what I assumed were background checks or reference calls. Interviews that seemed to go well would result in apologetic emails about finding a candidate who was a better fit for the company culture. Within 2 weeks, the pattern became unmistakably clear. I was being systematically blacklisted from every reputable firm in the region. The discovery that my parents had weaponized their business relationships against me was both infuriating and oddly impressive from a strategic standpoint. They were applying the same ruthless tactics they'd used to eliminate business competition, except now I was the target they intended to drive out of the market. Former family friends suddenly became unavailable when I called, and networking events I'd attended for years were suddenly private functions when I attempted to RSVP. Even my former Stanford classmates, who had once competed for my attention at alumni gatherings, now seemed to vanish whenever I reached out for potential job leads or professional connections. Swallowing my pride felt like trying to digest broken glass, but financial reality forced me to accept a position as a waitress at Murphy's Diner, the same establishment where Jake had recommended their coffee. The owner, Mrs. Murphy, was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who didn't care about my pedigree or my parents' vendetta. She needed someone who could take orders accurately, carry multiple plates without dropping them, and show up on time for minimum wage plus tips. The polyester uniform and sensible shoes were a far cry from the designer suits I'd worn to board meetings during my internships, but they represented something my expensive education never could: honest work that no one could take away from me. The customers at Murphy's provided a daily dose of humility mixed with occasional cruelty. Some genuinely didn't recognize the former heiress serving their coffee and scrambled eggs, treating me with the distant politeness reserved for service workers. Others clearly knew exactly who I was and seemed to take perverse pleasure in making subtle comments about my career change or asking if I missed the good life. A few regulars, particularly the construction workers who came in for early breakfast shifts, treated me with straightforward respect and left generous tips when they could afford it. Their kindness meant more to me than all the charity galas and society luncheons I'd attended in my previous life. Trevor Blackstone's appearance at the diner 3 weeks into my new employment felt like a predator stalking wounded prey. He slid into a corner booth during my evening shift, ordering nothing but coffee while watching me navigate between tables with obvious amusement. When the dinner rush finally ended and I had no choice but to approach his table, his smile was all teeth and malicious satisfaction. "Rebecca, darling, you're looking quite domestic these days," he said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "I have to say, this whole independence experiment is quite charming, but surely you're ready to be reasonable about our arrangement by now." His proposition was as insulting as it was predictable. He would graciously overlook my tantrum and still be willing to marry me, provided I apologized to my parents and acknowledged that I'd learned my lesson about the importance of family loyalty. In exchange, I could return to my comfortable life and never have to worry about rent money or polyester uniforms again. The condescension in his voice made my skin crawl, but what terrified me was his casual mention of how much worse things could become if I continued to be stubborn. He hinted at connections that could make finding any employment impossible, not just in our city but anywhere I might try to rebuild my life. My refusal was immediate and absolute, delivered with enough volume that several customers turned to stare. Trevor's facade of charm dropped instantly, replaced by a cold fury that reminded me why I'd instinctively disliked him from our first meeting years earlier. "You're making a serious mistake, Rebecca," he said, leaving exact change for his untouched coffee and a penny tip. "Your parents' patience isn't infinite, and neither is mine. Keep playing this game, and you'll discover just how small your world can become when the right people decide you're not welcome in it." That night, alone in my motel room with the flickering neon sign casting strange patterns on the ceiling, I experienced my first genuine panic attack. The walls felt like they were closing in, my chest tightened until I couldn't breathe properly, and the weight of my complete isolation crashed over me like a tsunami. I'd traded everything familiar and secure for principles I wasn't even sure I could afford to maintain. The girl who had grown up believing she could accomplish anything through education and determination was discovering that power and privilege operated by rules that no business school had ever taught. For the first time since leaving my parents' house, I seriously considered whether my pride was worth the price I was being forced to pay. The rumors started subtly, like poison seeping into groundwater before anyone notices the contamination. Former Stanford classmates began looking through me at alumni events as if I'd become invisible, and job interviews that had seemed promising would suddenly turn cold after the interviewer received what appeared to be urgent phone calls during our meetings. The whispers followed me wherever I went. Rebecca Martinez had suffered a mental breakdown, they said. She was struggling with substance abuse issues. Some versions claimed I'd stolen money from my parents, while others suggested I'd become involved with dangerous people who were influencing my judgment against my family's best interests. Maria Chen had worked as our family's housekeeper for 15 years, long enough to witness my transformation from a precocious child into what my parents considered their greatest disappointment. She found me during my lunch break at Murphy's Diner, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she slid into the booth across from me. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, but so was her determination to share what she'd overheard during her daily duties at the mansion. "Miss Rebecca, you need to know what they're saying about you," she whispered, glancing around the diner as if expecting my parents' security team to materialize from the shadows. The scope of my parents' campaign against me was more comprehensive than I'd imagined. They weren't simply using their business connections to block my employment opportunities, they were actively spreading detailed lies about my mental state and moral character throughout our entire social and professional network. Maria had overheard phone conversations where my mother described fabricated incidents of erratic behavior, including claims that I'd been caught stealing from charity organizations and that my college professors had expressed concerns about my psychological stability. "Your father, he meets with lawyers almost every day now," Maria continued, her voice barely audible above the diner's background noise. "They talk about something called conservatorship and how to prove you're not capable of making decisions for yourself. They have doctors ready to sign papers saying you're mentally unfit, even though they've never examined you. Mrs. Martinez, she keeps saying this is all for your own good, that you'll thank them someday when you're back home where you belong." The revelation that my parents were planning to have me declared legally incompetent felt like a physical blow to my chest. In their twisted logic, if they couldn't force me to comply through financial pressure and social isolation, they would simply remove my legal right to resist their control. The irony was devastating. The same parents who had insisted on the finest education money could buy were now prepared to argue that I was too unstable to make basic decisions about my own life. Maria's information about Trevor's family history was equally disturbing. The Blackstones had a pattern of acquiring struggling companies through strategic marriages, often targeting families with daughters who had significant inheritance claims. Trevor's previous engagement had ended when his fiancée mysteriously agreed to sign over her family's shipping business as part of their prenuptial agreement, only to have the engagement dissolved immediately afterward. The woman had subsequently disappeared from public view, and the Blackstone family had absorbed her company at a fraction of its actual value. "There's more," Maria said, pulling a manila envelope from her oversized purse. "I made copies of documents from your father's office when no one was watching. I don't understand all of it, but I think they're doing something illegal with money that's supposed to go to charity." The papers she handed me were photocopies of financial statements and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic embezzlement from the Martinez Family Foundation. Millions of dollars that were supposed to support educational scholarships and medical research were being diverted to offshore accounts controlled by shell companies with connections to both my parents and the Blackstone family. The money laundering scheme was sophisticated and had apparently been operating for years. Donations to the foundation were being routed through multiple international banks before ending up in investment accounts that funded luxury properties and business ventures that had nothing to do with charitable purposes. Trevor's role in the operation explained his family's sudden interest in formalizing their relationship with ours through marriage. I was the primary beneficiary of the foundation's legitimate assets, worth approximately $50 million, and my signature on the right documents would give them access to funds they'd been stealing piecemeal for years. My eviction from the Sunset Motel came without warning, delivered by a nervous manager who claimed there had been complaints about noise and inappropriate guests in my room. The accusations were obviously false, since I spent most of my time working at the diner and had never had visitors of any kind. When I pressed for specifics, the manager avoided eye contact and mentioned that the motel's owner had received a generous offer from a development company to purchase the entire property. The implication was clear: my parents had either bribed the management to remove me or bought the motel outright to ensure my eviction. Living in my Honda Civic parked behind a 24-hour laundromat was a new low that I hadn't anticipated when I'd made my stand for independence. The car was cramped and uncomfortable for sleeping, and I had to rely on the laundromat's public restroom for basic hygiene needs. The night shift attendant, an elderly man named Frank, eventually took pity on me and allowed me to park closer to the building where the security lights provided some measure of safety. He never asked questions about my circumstances, but he always made sure fresh coffee was available when I stumbled in during the early morning hours looking like I'd wrestled with insomnia and lost. The winter storm that hit our city 3 months after my eviction from home was particularly brutal, with temperatures dropping below 20 degrees and wind that cut through even the warmest clothes. My car's heating system wasn't designed for all-night operation, and I woke up several times during the worst night shivering uncontrollably despite wearing multiple layers. The realization that I could literally freeze to death while my parents slept comfortably in their mansion less than 10 miles away was a sobering reminder of how completely my circumstances had changed. By dawn, I was sick with what felt like the beginning stages of pneumonia, my chest tight and my breathing labored from the combination of cold air and stress. Frank found me in my car that morning barely conscious and immediately called an ambulance despite my protests that I couldn't afford emergency medical treatment. As the paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher, all I could think about was how my parents would react when they learned that their campaign to break my spirit had nearly resulted in my death. Part of me wondered if they would consider that an acceptable outcome, as long as it served as a warning to anyone else who might consider defying their authority. The hospital room felt like a luxury hotel compared to my recent accommodations, despite the sterile smell and constant noise from medical equipment. The diagnosis was pneumonia complicated by severe dehydration and exhaustion, conditions that the attending physician attributed to prolonged exposure and inadequate nutrition. When the billing department representative arrived with paperwork and questions about insurance coverage, I had to explain that my parents controlled my health insurance policy and had specifically instructed their provider to deny all claims related to my medical care. "That's unconscionable," the social worker assigned to my case said when she learned about my family's refusal to authorize payment for emergency treatment. "We're talking about a life-threatening medical condition, not cosmetic surgery. I've seen family disputes before, but deliberately withholding medical care crosses into criminal negligence territory." Her outrage on my behalf was both comforting and infuriating, because it confirmed that my parents' behavior was as extreme as it felt from my perspective, yet there seemed to be no practical recourse for their calculated cruelty. Jake Sullivan appeared at my bedside on the second day of my hospitalization, carrying flowers from the hospital gift shop and wearing an expression of genuine concern that I hadn't seen directed toward me in months. He'd learned about my condition from Frank at the laundromat, who'd been worried enough about my welfare to track down someone who might care about my recovery. "I know we don't know each other that well," Jake said, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair, "but nobody should have to deal with something like this alone. If you need help with the medical bills or anything else, just ask." His offer to assist with expenses I couldn't possibly repay was both touching and mortifying. Jake worked maintenance jobs and helped run his family's small motel business. He wasn't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, yet he was willing to take on debt to help someone who was essentially a stranger. The contrast between his immediate generosity and my parents' calculated malice was stark enough to bring tears to my eyes, though I attributed them to the medication and exhaustion rather than admit how desperately I needed someone to show basic human kindness. During the long hours of recovery, I spread Maria's photocopied documents across my hospital bed tray and began analyzing them with the skills I'd learned during my MBA program. The financial irregularities were extensive and systematic, representing years of deliberate fraud that violated multiple federal regulations governing charitable organizations. The Martinez Family Foundation was supposed to be supporting educational initiatives and medical research, but the money was being siphoned through shell companies into personal investment accounts that funded everything from vacation homes to art collections. The pattern of money laundering became clearer as I traced transactions through multiple bank statements and correspondence files. Legitimate donations were being mixed with funds from questionable sources, including several companies that were under investigation for environmental violations and labor disputes. Trevor's family shipping business was being used to transport goods that weren't clearly documented on customs forms, and some of the profits from these transactions were being funneled back into the foundation's accounts to make the books appear balanced. My parents' involvement in tax evasion was particularly sophisticated, involving offshore banks in countries with strict privacy laws and corporations registered in states with minimal disclosure requirements. They'd been systematically underreporting income from their real estate investments while claiming inflated deductions for charitable contributions that were actually just moving money between accounts they controlled. The total amount of unpaid taxes appeared to be in the tens of millions of dollars, accumulated over at least a decade of increasingly bold violations. When I contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division from the hospital payphone, I expected skepticism and bureaucratic delays. Instead, Agent Sarah Morrison seemed immediately interested in the information I was offering and asked detailed questions about my access to the documents and my relationship to the subjects of the potential investigation. "We've been looking at some unusual transactions involving charitable organizations and offshore banking," she explained. "Your information might be exactly what we need to establish a pattern of deliberate fraud rather than simple accounting errors." The timing of my parents' attempt to have me committed to a psychiatric facility was either incredibly coincidental or evidence that they suspected I'd become a threat to their criminal enterprise. Maria called the hospital to warn me that my father had contacted a private psychiatric facility and was claiming that I'd been making threats against family members and exhibiting signs of dangerous paranoia. The facility was preparing to send a team to collect me for emergency evaluation that could potentially result in involuntary commitment for up to 72 hours. Jake's assistance in helping me escape from the hospital before the psychiatric team arrived felt like something from a thriller movie rather than real life. He'd parked his truck near a service entrance and had borrowed scrubs from a friend who worked in the hospital laundry so I could walk out without being recognized by anyone who might be watching the main entrances. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally running away from people who claimed to want to help me, but I'd learned enough about my parents' manipulation tactics to know that any treatment they arranged would be designed to discredit my credibility rather than address any genuine mental health concerns. The safe house Jake had arranged was actually his uncle's hunting cabin about 2 hours outside the city, surrounded by enough wilderness to make unexpected visitors unlikely. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with running water, electricity, and most importantly, complete privacy from anyone who might be searching for me. For the first time in months, I could sleep through the night without worrying about eviction notices, threatening visits, or surveillance by people hired to monitor my activities. In the quiet isolation of the cabin, I began organizing the evidence Maria had provided and cross-referencing it with public records I could access through the cabin's internet connection. The scope of my parents' criminal activity was even larger than I'd initially realized, involving not just the family foundation but several legitimate businesses that were being used to launder money from sources that appeared to include drug trafficking and arms dealing. Trevor's shipping company was clearly a crucial component of the operation, providing a way to move both money and physical contraband without attracting attention from customs authorities. My counterattack strategy began forming during those weeks of isolation and planning. I couldn't simply turn over the evidence to federal investigators and hope for justice, because my parents had enough political connections to potentially interfere with any investigation. Instead, I needed to build an independent power base that would make me too valuable to destroy and too dangerous to ignore. The foundation money that was legally mine could provide the initial capital, but only if I could access it before they realized I was no longer the broken young woman they thought they'd successfully intimidated into submission. Part 6: Building the War Machine ****. Emerging from hiding after 6 weeks required carefully orchestrated identity changes that felt more like witness protection than voluntary relocation. Jake's connections in the construction industry provided access to people who specialized in helping individuals disappear from abusive situations, and they created documentation that would allow me to operate under an assumed name while maintaining legal access to my own financial accounts. Rebecca Martinez had been discredited and isolated, but Maya Sullivan, Jake's cousin who'd recently moved to the city for business opportunities, was a blank slate with clean references and no complicated family history. The small apartment I rented under my new identity was a far cry from the luxury I'd grown up with, but it represented something more valuable than comfort: complete independence from my parents' surveillance and control. The one-bedroom unit above a vintage bookstore came furnished with basic necessities and included utilities, leaving me with enough of my remaining savings to invest in the computer equipment and software licenses I'd need to launch a consulting business that could operate entirely online during its initial phase. Working 18-hour days became my new normal as I threw myself into building a financial analysis service that specialized in identifying irregularities in corporate accounting practices. My Stanford education finally proved useful in ways my parents had never intended, as I leveraged everything I'd learned about forensic accounting and business strategy to create tools that could detect the same kinds of fraud my own family had been perpetrating for years. The irony was satisfying. Their criminal enterprise had inadvertently provided me with expertise that very few legitimate consultants possessed. My first client came through a referral from one of Jake's friends who worked for a small tech startup experiencing cash flow problems they couldn't explain. The company's books appeared to be professionally managed, but profits that should have been accumulating were somehow disappearing into expense categories that didn't make sense when compared to actual business operations. Within 3 days of analyzing their financial records, I'd identified an embezzlement scheme orchestrated by their chief financial officer and recovered almost $200,000 in misappropriated funds. Word spread quickly through the startup community about the financial detective who'd saved a promising company from bankruptcy and exposed internal fraud that might have destroyed multiple investors' portfolios. Within 2 months, I had more clients than I could handle single-handedly, prompting me to hire my first employee. Sandra Kim, a recent accounting graduate who'd been struggling to find work with established firms because she lacked the social connections that open doors in traditional business environments. The software I developed for automated financial analysis proved to be even more valuable than my consulting services, because it could identify patterns of fraudulent activity across multiple companies simultaneously and flag transactions that might appear legitimate individually but formed suspicious patterns when viewed collectively. Tech companies were particularly interested in the software because they dealt with complex international transactions and needed tools that could detect money laundering or tax evasion schemes that might implicate them in criminal investigations. My parents' private investigators eventually tracked down my location, despite the careful identity precautions Jake and I had taken to conceal my activities. The discovery came when one of my former Stanford classmates mentioned seeing someone who looked exactly like Rebecca Martinez at a tech industry networking event, prompting my father to hire a surveillance team that specialized in locating missing persons. Within a week, they'd identified my apartment, my business, and my relationship with Jake, providing my parents with enough information to launch their next phase of attacks. Trevor's escalation to direct threats and property damage marked a new level of desperation in their campaign to force my submission. My car was vandalized twice in 1 week, with threatening messages scratched into the paint and sugar poured into the gas tank to disable the engine. Someone broke into my apartment while I was at work, destroying my computer equipment and stealing files related to my most important clients. The police were sympathetic but explained that without witnesses or physica. The success of my financial analysis company attracted attention I hadn't anticipated, both positive and negative. Within 2 years, we'd grown from a 1-person operation to a team of 15 employees specializing in forensic accounting and corporate fraud detection. Our client list included several Fortune 500 companies and 3 federal agencies that contracted our services for investigating financial crimes. The business valuation had reached $50 million, making me officially wealthier than I'd been even as a privileged daughter living on my parents' estate. My parents' response to my growing success was swift and vicious, demonstrating that their capacity for vindictive behavior had been significantly underestimated. They launched a coordinated campaign designed not just to damage my business but to destroy my credibility within the entire financial services industry. The attack began with whispered rumors at industry conferences, suggesting that my software was actually stealing proprietary algorithms from established firms and that my forensic accounting services were being used to cover up criminal activity rather than expose it. The bribery campaign they orchestrated to turn my clients against me was sophisticated and targeted. They approached key decision-makers at companies I served and offered lucrative business deals contingent on terminating their contracts with my firm. In cases where bribery wasn't effective, they resorted to more direct threats, including hints that companies continuing to work with me might face regulatory investigations or discover that their own business relationships with Martinez family enterprises would become problematic. Trevor's involvement in escalating the conflict to include government agencies represented a new level of corruption that shocked me even after everything I'd experienced with my family's criminal behavior. Using connections his shipping company had developed within customs and immigration enforcement, he arranged for my business to be subjected to multiple simultaneous investigations. Federal agents arrived at our offices with warrants claiming we were suspected of money laundering, corporate espionage, and facilitating tax evasion for international clients. The raids were clearly designed to be as disruptive and humiliating as possible, with agents arriving during our busiest hours and conducting searches that required shutting down all computer systems and preventing employees from accessing any work materials. Local news crews happened to be positioned perfectly to film the entire operation, suggesting that someone had provided advance notice about the timing and location of the raids. The footage of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from our offices was broadcast repeatedly, accompanied by speculation about the serious nature of whatever crimes had prompted such an extensive investigation. 2 of my most talented employees quit within days of the raids, explaining that they couldn't afford to be associated with a company under federal investigation regardless of whether the allegations proved to be false. Sandra Kim, who had become my closest collaborator and friend within the business, stayed despite receiving job offers from competing firms that promised her significantly higher salaries and protection from any legal complications that might arise from her association with my company. The financial pressure created by legal fees and lost contracts brought us closer to bankruptcy than I'd been since my days living in my car behind the laundromat. Our legal defense required multiple specialized attorneys, including experts in federal criminal law, corporate litigation, and intellectual property disputes. The costs were astronomical, and the investigations prevented us from taking on new clients who might otherwise have been eager to work with us. Jake's proposal of marriage came during the darkest period of the legal battles, when I was working 20-hour days trying to keep the business solvent while simultaneously preparing for depositions and document requests from 3 separate government agencies. His timing wasn't romantic, but it was perfect in terms of providing emotional stability when I desperately needed someone who believed in my innocence and my ability to survive the coordinated attack my parents had orchestrated. "I know this isn't exactly a fairy tale proposal," he said, presenting a simple engagement ring he'd saved for months to purchase. "But I also know that you're the strongest person I've ever met, and whatever they're trying to do to you, we'll get through it together. I believe in you, and I believe in us, and I'm not going anywhere no matter how complicated things get." His declaration of loyalty in the face of such overwhelming adversity meant more to me than any grand romantic gesture could have, because it represented the kind of unconditional support I'd never received from my biological family. The breakthrough in our legal situation came from an unexpected source. Maria Chen had continued working for my parents despite her sympathy for my situation, and she'd been carefully documenting their meetings with Trevor and their discussions about the campaign to destroy my business. Her recordings, made using a small device Jake had provided for her protection, captured detailed conversations about bribing government officials and manufacturing evidence to support the investigations against me. Maria's evidence was sufficient to prompt a counter-investigation by the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, which specialized in cases involving the abuse of government authority for personal or political purposes. Agent Morrison, who had been quietly investigating my parents based on the financial documents I'd provided months earlier, was able to coordinate between the different investigations and demonstrate that the raids on my business were part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior that included tax evasion, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The federal agents who had raided our offices under false pretenses were as shocked as anyone when they learned they'd been manipulated into participating in what amounted to an elaborate harassment campaign. The supervising agent personally apologized for the disruption to our business and expedited the return of all confiscated materials along with written documentation that our company had been cleared of all suspected wrongdoing. Trevor's arrest on money laundering charges related to his shipping company's involvement in my parents' criminal enterprise was particularly satisfying, because it demonstrated that their attempt to destroy me had ultimately led to their own exposure. During his interrogation, Trevor provided detailed information about the offshore banking schemes and charitable foundation fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence, effectively confirming everything I'd suspected about the scope of their illegal activities. The FBI raid on my parents' properties was conducted with the same dramatic flair they'd arranged for the investigation of my business, complete with news crews capturing footage of agents removing boxes of evidence from the mansion where I'd grown up. The irony of seeing my childhood home treated as a crime scene was both satisfying and deeply sad, representing the final destruction of any possibility that we might someday reconcile as a normal family. My business not only survived the coordinated attack but emerged stronger than before, as our successful defense against false accusations enhanced our credibility within the industry. Clients who had been pressured to terminate their contracts returned with apologies and significantly larger projects, and new clients specifically sought us out because they wanted to work with a firm that had been tested under extreme pressure and proven its integrity. The decision to take my company public came 18 months after the federal investigations concluded, when our annual revenue had reached $200 million and venture capital firms were aggressively competing to invest in our expansion. The initial public offering was priced at $50 per share, valuing the company at $800 million on the day of trading debut. By the closing bell, investor demand had driven the stock price to $73 per share, making my personal stake worth approximately $500 million. The financial news media coverage of our IPO success story was extensive and uniformly positive, focusing on the innovative technology we'd developed and the impressive client list we'd assembled in such a short timeframe. Several articles mentioned my family background and the legal battles we'd overcome, but the emphasis was on business achievement rather than personal drama. For the first time since leaving my parents' house, I was being recognized for my professional accomplishments rather than my family connections or the controversy surrounding my independence. My parents' criminal trial was scheduled to begin 3 months after our IPO, ensuring that their legal troubles would receive significant media attention at exactly the moment when my business success was being celebrated throughout the financial industry. The contrast between their impending imprisonment and my professional triumph felt like poetic justice, demonstrating that their attempts to destroy me had ultimately accelerated my success rather than preventing it. The wedding Jake and I planned was deliberately modest and private, held at a small vineyard outside the city with only 20 guests who represented the people who had supported us during our most difficult periods. Maria Chen was my maid of honor, Sandra Kim served as a bridesmaid, and Frank from the laundromat walked me down the aisle since I had no family members willing or worthy to perform that traditional role. The absence of my parents and their social circle made the celebration more meaningful rather than less, because everyone present had chosen to be there based on genuine affection rather than social obligation. The expansion of my business into international markets required establishing offices in London, Tokyo, and Singapore, creating employment opportunities for hundreds of professionals who specialized in financial analysis and corporate fraud detection. Our proprietary software was being licensed to banks and investment firms worldwide, generating recurring revenue streams that made the company increasingly valuable even as we grew larger and more complex to manage. My appearance on the Fortune magazine list of America's most powerful women under 40 was accompanied by a cover story that detailed my journey from family disgrace to corporate leader, though the article focused more on business strategy than personal relationships. The recognition was validating, but it also marked my emergence as a public figure whose success would be scrutinized by both supporters and critics who might have their own agendas for either celebrating or undermining my achievements. The approaches from my former friends and social acquaintances who had abandoned me during my period of exile were pathetically transparent in their opportunism. People who had actively shunned me when I was struggling to survive suddenly remembered our close friendship and suggested lunch meetings to catch up now that I was wealthy and influential again. Their messages were carefully worded to avoid acknowledging their previous betrayal while positioning themselves to benefit from any future business or social opportunities one might offer. My policy of selective forgiveness was based on clear criteria. I was willing to rebuild relationships with people who acknowledged their mistakes and demonstrated genuine remorse, but I had no interest in resuming connections with individuals who simply wanted to pretend their abandonment had never occurred. The process of evaluating each overture for sincerity versus opportunism was emotionally exhausting, but it helped me distinguish between relationships worth salvaging and people who would likely disappoint me again if circumstances changed. The community support for my business ventures was particularly gratifying because it came from people who had no expectation of personal benefit from their encouragement. Local newspapers wrote editorial pieces praising my contributions to job creation and economic development in the region. Small business owners approached me at public events to thank me for providing services that had helped them detect and prevent fraud that could have destroyed their livelihoods. My parents' attempts at reconciliation through intermediaries began during the pre-trial period when their attorneys were clearly concerned about the strength of the prosecution's case. Former family friends and distant relatives started calling to suggest that perhaps it was time to put the past behind us and remember that family bonds are more important than temporary disagreements. The transparent nature of these peace overtures, coming only after it became clear that I was successfully independent and their legal situation was desperate, made them easier to reject than I'd anticipated. When our company valuation reached $1 billion following a major acquisition deal with an international banking consortium, I realized that I had achieved something my parents never would have thought possible. I had built a business empire larger and more legitimate than anything they had ever controlled. The irony that their attempt to force me into a subordinate role had ultimately motivated me to surpass their achievements was not lost on the business journalists who covered our success story. The billion-dollar milestone represented more than financial achievement. It symbolized the complete transformation of my identity from victim to victor, from dependent daughter to independent entrepreneur, from someone who had been rejected by her family to someone who had built a better family from scratch. The little girl who had once desperately sought her parents' approval had become a woman who no longer needed anyone's validation to know her own worth. The charitable foundation I established with 20% of my company's equity was deliberately designed to support exactly the causes my parents had been stealing from: educational scholarships for disadvantaged students and medical research funding. The foundation's board included Maria Chen, Jake's parents, and several other people who had shown kindness when I needed it most. Every dollar we distributed represented not just philanthropy but a deliberate reversal of the harm my parents had caused through their fraudulent activities. The guilty verdict in my parents' criminal trial was delivered on a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 4 years after they had thrown me out of their house for refusing to marry Trevor Blackstone. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before finding them guilty on multiple counts of tax evasion, money laundering, and charitable fraud. The judge's sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but legal experts predicted prison terms of 12 to 15 years based on the severity and duration of their criminal activities. My decision to purchase the family mansion at the foreclosure auction was purely strategic rather than sentimental. The property had been seized as part of the criminal asset forfeiture proceedings, and its sale was intended to help fund restitution payments to the charitable organizations my parents had defrauded. By acquiring it for significantly less than its market value, I ensured that the money would be used for legitimate purposes while also gaining control over a location that held too many painful memories to be left in the hands of strangers. The conversion of my childhood home into the Martinez Center for Women's Entrepreneurship and Emergency Housing represented a symbolic transformation of everything the mansion had once represented. The formal dining room where I'd been served my parents' ultimatum became a conference facility where women could receive business development training and legal advice for starting their own companies. The master bedroom suite where my parents had planned their campaign against me was converted into apartments for women escaping domestic violence or economic abuse. My parents' release pending appeal came as an unwelcome surprise, facilitated by expensive attorneys who had convinced an appellate court that their continued detention posed unnecessary health risks that could be managed through electronic monitoring and asset seizure. They were forbidden from leaving the state and required to surrender their passports, but they were free to live in the small apartment they'd been forced to rent after losing their mansion and most of their liquid assets to legal fees and restitution orders. The confrontation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure occurred on a cold December afternoon when my parents appeared at the front gates of what had once been their estate. They looked older and smaller than I remembered, diminished by months of legal proceedings and the stress of their dramatically reduced circumstances. My father's expensive suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing that didn't quite fit properly, and my mother's perfectly styled appearance showed signs of being maintained by less expensive professionals than she was accustomed to using. "Rebecca, sweetheart, we need to talk," my mother said through the intercom system, her voice carrying a pleading tone I'd never heard before. "We've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and we want to make things right between us. You're our daughter, and we love you more than anything in this world. Please give us a chance to explain and apologize properly." The desperation in her words was unmistakable, but it was accompanied by the same manipulative undertone that had characterized our relationship throughout my childhood. My father's approach was more direct and arguably more honest in its acknowledgement of their changed circumstances. "We lost everything because we were trying to protect what we thought was best for the family legacy," he said when I finally agreed to meet them in the mansion's front garden. "We made serious errors in judgment about business practices and about how to handle our relationship with you. We're asking for your help, not because we deserve it, but because we're hoping you might be willing to show us the kind of mercy we failed to show you." The conversation that followed was surreal in its reversal of our historical power dynamic. My parents, who had once controlled every aspect of my life through financial manipulation and social pressure, were now asking me to provide them with employment and financial support that would allow them to avoid complete destitution. They were offering to work at my charitable foundation in exchange for minimal salaries, essentially proposing to become my employees in an organization funded by the wealth I'd accumulated through their rejection of me. "Do you understand what you're asking?" I said, struggling to maintain composure as the full irony of their proposal became clear. "You want me to hire you to work at a foundation dedicated to helping people recover from exactly the kind of abuse you subjected me to. You want me to pay you salaries from money I earned after you tried to destroy my ability to earn a living. You want me to trust you with vulnerable people after you spent years demonstrating that you're willing to steal from charities and manipulate legal systems for personal gain." Their response revealed that they still fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their crimes and the extent of the damage they had caused. My mother insisted that their actions had been motivated by love and concern for my future, even though they had involved systematic theft from organizations that helped disadvantaged people. My father argued that their business practices were common in their industry, despite the federal convictions that proved their activities violated multiple laws designed to protect both taxpayers and charitable beneficiaries. The realization that my parents would never genuinely acknowledge the severity of their behavior or accept responsibility for the consequences of their choices was both liberating and heartbreaking. I had spent years hoping that they might eventually understand why I'd been unwilling to accept their control over my life, but their continued justification of criminal behavior demonstrated that such understanding was impossible for people who viewed themselves as perpetual victims of circumstances beyond their control. Trevor Blackstone's sentencing to 15 years in federal prison provided a satisfying conclusion to his role in the conspiracy against me, particularly because his cooperation with prosecutors had failed to earn him the reduced sentence he'd been hoping for. His shipping business was seized and sold to pay restitution to the various parties his family had defrauded over the years, and his personal assets were liquidated to fund victim compensation programs. The man who had once threatened to make my world very small was now facing a future in which his own world would be reduced to the confines of a federal penitentiary. My final words to my parents were delivered with more sadness than anger, because I had reached a point where their approval or disapproval no longer had the power to affect my emotional well-being. "I forgive you for the damage you caused, because carrying hatred for you would only continue to hurt me," I told them as they prepared to leave the property for what would likely be the last time. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm willing to pretend that your actions were acceptable or that you can be trusted not to repeat them. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences just like everyone else." Their departure from the mansion grounds felt anticlimactic after years of anticipating such a moment. The parents who had once seemed all-powerful in their ability to control my life through financial manipulation and social pressure had been reduced to ordinary people facing ordinary consequences for extraordinary crimes. The fear and anger they had inspired in me for so many years had been replaced by something much more powerful: complete indifference to their opinions and expectations. 5 years have passed since that final confrontation with my parents, and my life has evolved in ways that would have seemed impossible during my darkest moments of sleeping in my car and wondering if I would survive their campaign to destroy me. The business empire I built from nothing now employs more than 3,000 people across 15 countries, providing financial analysis and fraud detection services to governments, corporations, and nonprofit organizations worldwide. Our annual revenue exceeds $2 billion, and our proprietary technology has prevented an estimated $50 billion in fraudulent transactions. Jake and I have two beautiful children now, Emma, who just turned 3 and has inherited her father's kind heart and stubborn independence, and Michael, 18 months old with eyes that sparkle with the same curiosity I remember having as a child. Watching them grow up in an environment of unconditional love and support has helped me understand what normal family relationships should look like, while also healing wounds I didn't realize I was still carrying from my own dysfunctional childhood. My parents live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town, surviving on Social Security payments and occasional assistance from distant relatives who take pity on their reduced circumstances. They have never attempted to contact me again after our final meeting, and I have made no effort to inquire about their welfare or maintain any connection to their lives. According to Maria Chen, who occasionally sees them at the grocery store where she shops, they appear to be aging rapidly and seem confused about how their privileged lives deteriorated so completely. The Martinez Center for Women's Entrepreneurship has provided services to more than 10,000 women since its establishment, offering everything from emergency housing to business development loans to legal advocacy for domestic violence survivors. The irony that my childhood home has become a sanctuary for women escaping the kind of controlling relationships my parents tried to force me into feels like perfect justice, transforming a place of painful memories into a source of hope and empowerment for others. The scholarship program I established at Stanford Business School specifically targets students from disadvantaged backgrounds who demonstrate exceptional potential but lack the family connections that smooth the path to success in traditional business environments. Every year, I personally meet with the scholarship recipients to share my story and remind them that their worth isn't determined by their family's wealth or social status, but by their willingness to work hard and persist through challenges that might seem insurmountable. The lessons I've learned from my journey from family disgrace to business success are complex and sometimes contradictory, but they center around the fundamental truth that authentic relationships are based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than financial manipulation or social obligation. The people who stood by me during my most difficult period, Jake, Maria, Sandra, and even Frank from the laundromat, proved their loyalty when I had nothing to offer them in return except gratitude and friendship. Success, I've discovered, isn't just about accumulating wealth or achieving professional recognition, though both can be satisfying when earned through honest effort rather than inherited privilege. True success is about building a life aligned with your values, surrounding yourself with people who see your worth as a human being rather than as an economic asset, and using whatever advantages you gain to create opportunities for others who face similar challenges. The media attention my story has attracted over the years has provided a platform to speak about issues that matter deeply to me. The importance of financial independence for women, the need for stronger oversight of charitable organizations, and the reality that family relationships based on control rather than love ultimately harm everyone involved. Speaking at business conferences and university commencements gives me opportunities to encourage others who might be struggling against similar obstacles. My relationship with Trevor's former fiancée, whom I located through private investigators and eventually befriended, has provided additional perspective on the pattern of abuse my parents and their business partners used to maintain control over people they viewed as assets rather than individuals. Sarah Matthews lost her family's shipping business to the Blackstones through the same coercive tactics they attempted to use against me, but she lacked the resources and support system that enabled me to fight back effectively. The criminal justice system's handling of white-collar crime remains frustratingly inadequate, as demonstrated by my parents' early release from prison after serving only 8 years of their 12-year sentences. Their good behavior in minimum security facilities earned them time reductions that seemed disproportionate to the magnitude of harm they caused to charitable organizations and the individuals those organizations were supposed to help. The system appears designed to accommodate criminals who commit sophisticated financial crimes while treating street-level offenses with much greater severity. Looking back on the moment when my parents threw me out of their house for refusing to marry Trevor Blackstone, I can honestly say that it was the greatest gift they ever gave me, though they certainly didn't intend it that way. Being forced to build my own life from nothing taught me capabilities I never would have developed if I'd remained comfortable within their controlled environment. The strength, resilience, and independence I gained through surviving their attempts to break my spirit became the foundation for achievements that exceeded anything I could have accomplished as their obedient daughter. The family Jake and I have built together, along with the chosen family of loyal friends and colleagues who supported us through our struggles, represents everything my biological family failed to provide. Unconditional love, mutual respect, and shared commitment to each other's success and happiness. Our children will grow up knowing that their worth isn't contingent on meeting other people's expectations or conforming to predetermined roles, but on developing their own character and pursuing their own dreams with integrity and compassion. What advice would I offer to others facing similar family betrayals or seemingly impossible obstacles to achieving their goals? First, recognize that people who truly care about your well-being will support your autonomy rather than trying to control your choices, even when they disagree with your decisions. Second, never underestimate your own capacity to survive and thrive in circumstances that seem overwhelming, because desperation can motivate creativity and determination that comfort never could. Third, invest your energy in building relationships with people who value you for who you are rather than what you can provide them. The business empire I built serves purposes beyond personal financial gain, though I won't pretend that wealth hasn't provided security and opportunities that make life significantly easier than it was during my homeless period. Our companies create jobs for people who might otherwise struggle to find employment. Our charitable foundation provides resources for individuals facing the kinds of challenges I once faced, and our success story demonstrates that family rejection doesn't have to mean personal failure. Sometimes people ask whether I would change anything about my journey if I could go back and make different choices, and the answer is complicated. I wouldn't wish the pain and fear I experienced on anyone, but I also wouldn't trade the person those experiences helped me become for a more comfortable version of myself who never learned her own strength. The woman who stands here today, speaking to graduating students about turning obstacles into opportunities, is someone my pampered younger self never could have become. The greatest victory isn't the financial success or public recognition, though both are satisfying after years of being dismissed as a failure and disappointment. The greatest victory is the knowledge that I built something meaningful and lasting from the ashes of a life that was supposed to be predetermined by other people's expectations and limitations. Every woman who starts her own business with support from our foundation, every fraudulent scheme that our software helps detect and prevent, every child who grows up in a home where love isn't conditional on obedience represents a small triumph over the forces that tried to break my spirit and steal my future. My final message to anyone watching this story and recognizing elements of their own struggles is this. The people who underestimate your potential are giving you a tremendous strategic advantage, because they won't see you coming until you've already surpassed them. Use their dismissal as motivation rather than discouragement. Surround yourself with people who believe in your capabilities even when you doubt them yourself, and remember that the most satisfying revenge against those who try to limit your possibilities is building a life so successful and fulfilling that their opinions become completely irrelevant to your happiness. Sometimes the greatest gift your enemies give you is underestimating what you're capable of becoming when they finally stop standing in your way. What challenges have you overcome that seemed impossible at the time but ultimately made you stronger? Have you ever had to choose between family approval and personal authenticity? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because we all need reminders that we're not alone in facing difficult relationships or seemingly insurmountable obstacles. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others who might need to hear this message find it, and subscribe for more stories about turning life's greatest challenges into unexpected opportunities. Share this video with anyone who might be struggling with family pressure or financial difficulties, because sometimes knowing that someone else survived and thrived can provide the hope and motivation needed to keep fighting for your own dreams. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember that your current circumstances don't determine your future possibilities unless you allow them to. Keep building the life you deserve, one brave decision at a time.